In 1989, quietly and without much ceremony, the British government sold Inmos to a French-Italian conglomerate. The sale erased Britain's most ambitious attempt to dictate the global future of microprocessors. A decade earlier, the state had gambled £50 million to build a chip company from scratch. They built a manufacturing plant in Newport, Wales. They built the Transputer, a processor that did not just calculate, but communicated, allowing dozens of chips to be linked together to form desktop supercomputers. The engineers in Bristol had built a silicon architecture that could theoretically outperform anything coming out of California. But by the time the sale went through, the ecosystem was collapsing. British universities loved the machine, but the global market had already chosen the IBM-compatible personal computer. Intel was winning not with a superior design, but with brute force standardization. The paradox was cruel. The Transputer was not abandoned because it was obsolete. It was abandoned because it was 20 years too early. But the real story of Inmos is not only the story of a corporate sale, it is the story of how Britain built the multi-core future, only to watch Silicon Valley conquer the world with a simpler, older idea. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, platforms, shops, software houses, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in a government funding office in London in 1978. In 1978, the British technology establishment was looking across the Atlantic with a growing sense of panic. Silicon Valley was rapidly consolidating its grip on the future. Intel and Motorola were churning out microprocessors that were becoming the standard engines of the new computing age. Britain, despite its rich history of computing breakthroughs in Manchester and Cambridge, was in danger of becoming merely a customer in the microelectronics revolution. The response came from the National Enterprise Board, a government body designed to intervene in industry. They approved a staggering $50 million of public funding to create a completely new British semiconductor company, Inmos. This was not a modest startup operating out of a garage. It was a state-backed gamble to buy Britain a seat at the top table of global technology. The company established its design center in Bristol, drawing on deep engineering talent, while manufacturing was directed to a state-of-the-art fabrication plant in Newport, South Wales. But the founders of Inmos, including British computer scientist Ian Barron, knew that simply copying American designs would be a fast track to failure. Intel already had the scale, the factories, and the market share. To beat California, the engineers in Bristol had to identify a fundamental weakness in how American chips operated and exploit it. They found that weakness in a constraint known as the von Neumann bottleneck. In a standard computer, the processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions, and the memory, the fast temporary storage a computer uses while programs are running, are physically separate. The processor must constantly reach across a physical pathway to fetch instructions from memory, wait, process them, and send the result back. As processors grew faster, this constant fetching and waiting became the absolute speed limit of a machine. It did not matter how fast the processor was if the pathway to memory was jammed. Inmos proposed a radical alternative. They called it the Transputer. The concept was brilliant in its elegance. Instead of separating the processor and the memory, the Transputer combined them onto a single piece of silicon. But it went much further. Each chip was equipped with high-speed communication links, allowing it to talk directly to other transputers. If a British university lab or a software house needed more computing power, they did not have to wait years for Intel to design a faster central processor. They could simply buy a second transputer, wire it to the first, and instantly double their processing capacity. If they needed supercomputer performance, they could link dozens or even hundreds of transputers together in a grid. This was parallel processing, breaking a massive calculation down into smaller parts and solving them all at exactly the same time. However, hardware was only half of the ecosystem. A machine that computes in parallel cannot run standard software. Standard programs were written sequentially, executing one instruction after another. To make the Transputer work, the Bristol team had to invent an entirely new operating language. They called it Occam, named after the medieval English philosopher William of Ockham. Occam was designed specifically to manage parallel tasks, directing the flow of data between multiple chips with flawless precision. In a British university lab, a programmer writing in Occam was not just coding an application, they were orchestrating a symphony of silicon. For a brief moment, it seemed the government's gamble had paid off. In 1985, Inmos finally launched the first commercial 32-bit transputer, the T414. Surviving trade press accounts from the period describe a mixture of awe and bewilderment. In computer labs across the country, researchers quickly realized that they were holding a desktop supercomputer. The T414 could process instructions at a speed that made contemporary American chips look sluggish. The physical object itself, a square ceramic package with gold pins, felt like a piece of the future that had accidentally fallen into the present. The early reception in specialized fields was overwhelmingly positive. Aerospace companies, military contractors, and high-end engineering firms looked at the transputer and saw the exact mathematical horsepower they had been waiting for. It was adopted in radar systems, flight simulators, and robotics, places where processing massive amounts of data at the exact same time was a matter of life and death. But a technology empire is not built solely in university labs or military installations. To survive the brutal economics of the semiconductor industry, Inmos needed volume. They needed the transputer to break into the commercial mainstream, to become the brain of the next generation of business machines and home computers. The architecture was brilliant, the silicon was real, and the universities were amazed. Now Inmos just had to convince the rest of the world to throw away its old code and rewrite its software. The T414 had proven that a computer and its memory could live on the same piece of silicon. But the true breakthrough for Inmos arrived in 1987 with the release of the T800 transputer. If the earlier model was a proof of concept, the T800 was a masterpiece of British engineering. It was the chip that finally gave the architecture the raw, undeniable power needed to challenge the American semiconductor giants directly. The secret to the T800 was the integration of a floating point unit, or FPU. A floating point unit is a specialized section of a processor designed specifically to handle extremely complex decimal mathematics at extreme speeds. Before the T800, an FPU was usually a separate, expensive chip that had to be bought and installed alongside the main processor. Inmos placed it directly onto the same silicon die as the main processor, the memory, and the communication links. In a British university lab, such as the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre at the University of Edinburgh, this integration changed the physical reality of research. A researcher attempting to model fluid dynamics, simulate weather patterns, or render complex three-dimensional physics no longer had to book time on a massive centralized university mainframe and wait days for the results. The T800 meant that calculations requiring millions of decimal operations per second could now be executed on a workstation before the researcher left for the pub. It democratized extreme mathematics. To understand the magnitude of this breakthrough, it must be compared to what was happening in California. In the same era, Intel was pushing the 801-3886 processor into millions of standard business computers. The American approach to speed was fundamentally different. Intel relied on brute force, increasing the clock speed of a single processor so it could execute sequential instructions faster. But as the clock speed rose, the chips grew hotter, hungrier for power, and increasingly bottlenecked by their connection to external memory. The transputer was the elegant alternative. It did not need to run at melting temperatures to achieve high performance. If a task was too heavy for one T800, a programmer did not wait for Inmos to invent a faster chip. They simply wired 4, 8, or 16 T800s together. The communication links on the edges of the chip operated at 20 megabits per second, a blistering speed for the 1980s, allowing the chips to whisper data back and forth without ever bothering the main system memory. This was a structural moat that competitors could not easily copy. Intel could not suddenly add communication links to their x86 processors without completely breaking compatibility with the millions of MS-DOS programs that businesses relied on. Silicon Valley was locked into a highly profitable but architecturally limited sequential past. Inmos had a clean slate, and they used it to build systems that look like science fiction. The most striking physical manifestation of this breakthrough was the Mako computing surface. Formed in Bristol by a group of former Inmos engineers who had grown frustrated with the company's slow commercialization, Mako set out to build a supercomputer entirely out of transputers. The Mako computing surface did not look like a traditional beige office machine. It was often housed in tall, glass-fronted black cabinets. Behind the glass, banks of transputer boards sat vertically, studded with glowing LEDs. Each light represented a single processor working in harmony with the others. When a complex program was running, the lights would ripple and dance, providing a real-time physical display of parallel computing in action. It was a visual spectacle that proved British hardware could scale from a single desktop board to a towering supercomputer simply by clicking more silicon together. The price and access context changed completely. A traditional American Cray supercomputer could cost millions of pounds, required a dedicated cooling infrastructure, and occupied an entire room. A Mako system could deliver comparable performance for a fraction of the cost, plugging into a standard power socket. Suddenly, institutions like the Royal Signals and Radar Establishment or mid-sized British engineering firms could afford processing power that was previously restricted to national defense budgets. But the transputer did not only live in glass cabinets. It reached the British consumer market through expansion boards. Readers of Personal Computer World magazine began seeing mail-order adverts for transputer boards that could be slotted directly into a standard IBM-compatible PC. In a box room or a startup office, a user could open up their mundane beige desktop, slide a transputer board into a spare slot, and connect it via ribbon cables. The standard PC would continue to run its basic operating system, acting merely as a keyboard and a screen, while the transputer board took over the heavy lifting. It turned a high-street machine bought from Dixon's into a graphics workstation capable of rendering complex 3D animations or calculating Mandelbrot fractals at speeds that defied belief. Yet holding this ecosystem together required a monumental cognitive leap. To extract this performance, developers had to write their software in Occam. In a startup office, a programmer used to writing standard sequential code in C or Pascal had to entirely rewire their brain. Occam forced the programmer to stop thinking of code as a list of instructions read one by one. Instead, they had to imagine data as water flowing through a network of pipes, splitting apart to be processed simultaneously by different chips, and then joining back together flawlessly. When it worked, it was beautiful. The architecture had proven it could scale from a single expansion board on a bedroom desk to a towering glass cabinet in a research facility. The silicon was unmatched, the universities were sold, and the computing press was mesmerized. The brand had found its audience. The market had not yet shown the price. By 1988, the transputer had reached its zenith. For a brief, dazzling window, the British gamble appeared to have paid off. The T800 was not just a theoretical triumph, it was a physical product shipping out of the fabrication plant and into the most advanced research facilities on Earth. Inmos had captured what industry analysts estimated to be over 70% of the global parallel processing market. The dream of Bristol had become a tangible reality. The physical manufacturing of this dream took place at the Inmos facility in Newport, South Wales. In an area historically defined by heavy industry and coal, the plant was a beacon of the new economy. Inside sterile, clean rooms, local workers in white protective suits oversaw the etching of microscopic circuits onto silicon wafers. This was the exact manifestation of the government's original vision. British labor, British engineering, and British intellectual property combining to manufacture a product that the rest of the world desperately needed. The architecture began to appear everywhere extreme performance was required. At CERN in Switzerland, European physicists used transputer arrays to filter and process the massive streams of collision data from particle accelerators. The European Space Agency integrated the chips into their satellite control systems, trusting the elegant, predictable timing of the Occam language to keep machines alive in the hostile vacuum of space. But the cultural heart of the transputer boom remained firmly in Britain. It became a point of fierce national pride in university computer science departments. At the University of Bristol, the University of Oxford, and the University of Edinburgh, entire curriculums were restructured around parallel computing. In a British university lab where researchers crowded around a single Mako terminal, the right architecture did not merely run software faster. It decided who would own the next decade of discovery, who would define how machines thought, and whether Britain could finally build a platform that the rest of the world would be forced to follow. For the students sitting in those labs typing lines of Occam on mechanical keyboards, the transputer was not just a component, it was an ideology. They were being taught that the American method of standard, sequential processing was a dead end, a brute force relic of the 1970s. The future, they were told, was parallel, and it was British. The ecosystem expanded rapidly to support this belief. British software houses began releasing compilers that allowed programmers to write C or Fortran code and translate it onto the transputer, lowering the barrier to entry for those unwilling to learn Occam. British companies like Parsees, a spin-off from the electronics giant EMI, built parallel supercomputers for commercial buyers. Meanwhile, Perihelion Software created Helios, an operating system, the core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run, designed specifically to handle multiple transputers at once. It looked and felt like the industry standard Unix, meaning businesses could theoretically adopt the transputer without retraining their entire workforce. High-street electronics magazines like Byte and Personal Computer World dedicated lengthy feature articles to the architecture, treating it not as a niche curiosity, but as the inevitable next step for the personal computer. Smaller British manufacturers built evaluation boards, such as the B04, which allowed smaller businesses and wealthy enthusiasts to plug a T4 or T800 directly into a standard PC motherboard. Suddenly, graphic design agencies in London could render three-dimensional animations in hours rather than days. Yet despite these triumphs in high-end workstations and embedded systems, Inmos knew that true global dominance required conquering the desktop. They needed a mass-market machine, a consumer device that would put a transputer into a standard office, wrapping this immense parallel power in an interface that normal people could use. The classroom was ready. The universities were convinced. Britain still had to decide where this future would actually live. In 1987, the opportunity to conquer the consumer desktop finally arrived, wrapped in the branding of one of the era's most famous electronics companies, Atari. Atari was looking for a machine that could elevate them from the home computer and gaming market into the lucrative world of high-end professional workstations. They partnered with Inmos and Perihelion Software to create something that the computing press had long fantasized about: the Atari Transputer Workstation, eventually known as the ATW-800. The ATW-800 was a physical manifestation of the ultimate British tech dream. It was a large, imposing gray tower that housed a standard Motorola processor to handle the basic keyboard and screen inputs, whilst a T800 transputer sat on a massive internal board, waiting to perform the heavy computational lifting. It ran the Helios operating system, giving it a professional, multitasking interface, and it featured a custom video chip that could display 16 million colors at a time when most standard business PCs were still struggling with 16. When the ATW-800 was demonstrated at events like the Personal Computer World Show in London, it drew crowds of mesmerized programmers, journalists, and enthusiasts. They watched a desktop machine, priced at a fraction of a traditional supercomputer, rendering ray-traced three-dimensional spheres and complex mathematical fractals in real time. It was a public spectacle of pure processing dominance. For the British engineers watching from Bristol and Newport, this was the pinnacle. In a British startup office, the right workstation did not merely run software. It decided who would own the next era of digital creation, who could afford to build three-dimensional worlds, and whether the high street would buy a British parallel future or settle for an American sequential compromise. During this peak period, the transputer felt inevitable. It featured heavily in BBC computing programs. Books on learning the Occam language began to appear on the shelves of W.H. Smith in university bookshops. The European community poured funding into projects specifically designed to utilize Inmos architecture. By the late 1980s, if an engineer or a computer scientist in Britain looked at the trajectory of the industry, they saw a world where a single processor would no longer be enough. They saw a future built on parallel networks, and they knew they held the patent. But this immense cultural and academic glory masked a severe commercial vulnerability. The Transputer was a critical success, a scientific marvel, and a point of immense national pride. Yet the British government had not invested £50 million of taxpayer money simply to win academic awards or build niche graphic workstations. They had invested to create a profitable, self-sustaining semiconductor giant capable of fighting Silicon Valley for global market share. Despite the incredible performance of the T800, the volume of sales required to sustain a state-of-the-art silicon fabrication plant in Wales was astronomical. The high-end workstation market and the academic supercomputer market were prestigious, but they were small. To survive, Inmos needed the Transputer to become the default standard for everyday business computing. In a university lab, the Transputer was a miracle of logic. But outside the lab, the global market was about to prove that convenience always defeats perfection. The first crack was almost invisible. It did not happen with a dramatic failure of silicon inside the Newport fabrication plant, nor did it happen in a university lab where the architecture was still revered. It happened quietly in the purchasing departments of mid-sized British businesses and on the desks of software developers who looked at a brilliant piece of British engineering and chose to write code for a boring American one instead. The Transputer was about to be crushed by two immense pressures: Force 3, standards, ecosystems, and developer support, and Force 4, global scale, American standards, and convenience displacement. A machine could be clever, well-designed, and culturally important, yet still lose if the ecosystem stopped growing. The trap was simple. A platform needed users to attract software, and it needed software to attract users. Once that loop broke, the decline could accelerate with terrifying speed. The first public sign of this break was the Atari Transputer workstation. The ATW-800 had been designed to put parallel computing on the high street, but it arrived at a steep price and without a vast library of ready-made business software. It was too expensive for the traditional Atari gaming audience and entirely too unfamiliar for corporate IT departments. Despite the magazine hype and the mesmerized crowds at computer fairs, the machine quietly failed. Surviving records suggest that fewer than 400 units were ever manufactured. The great consumer breakthrough was over before it began. The British architecture was learning a painful lesson about the global market. Convenience did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be available, automatic, and compatible with what a user already owned. This convenience was being mass-produced in Silicon Valley, while Inmos was trying to convince the world to fundamentally change how it thought about computing. Intel was releasing the 80386 processor. Architecturally, the Intel chip was everything the Inmos engineers despised. It was a sequential, brute force engine, but it possessed one unbeatable advantage: backward compatibility. Backward compatibility, the ability of a new computer to run software written for older systems, was not just an engineering feature. In a British office on a Tuesday morning, it meant a small business could buy a new IBM-compatible PC, plug it in, and instantly run their existing MS-DOS accounting programs, their old word processors, and their familiar databases without rewriting a single line of code. The Transputer offered a revolution, but the global market did not want a revolution. It wanted the exact same software it used yesterday, just running slightly faster today. In a startup office, a developer faced a brutal economic choice. They could spend months retraining their team to learn Occam, restructuring their software into parallel streams to run flawlessly on a Transputer. This would result in a masterpiece of code, but it would only sell to the tiny fraction of the market that owned an Inmos board. Alternatively, They could write standard sequential C code for an Intel processor, which would instantly be compatible with millions of beige desktop computers sitting on office desks from London to Los Angeles. The developers followed the larger market. To combat this, British software houses tried to build compilers that could automatically translate standard C or Fortran code so it could run on a transputer. But this defeated the entire purpose of the architecture. Running sequential code on a parallel processor was like putting a horse-drawn cart onto a modern motorway. It moved, but it stripped away all the speed and elegance that made the system valuable in the first place. Meanwhile, the American brute force approach was working. Intel was riding the wave of Moore's law, discovering that they did not need to invent parallel computing to make chips faster. They could simply shrink the transistors, crank up the clock speed, and add a memory cache, a small, ultra-fast storage area physically close to the processor to partially relieve the von Neumann bottleneck. The chips ran incredibly hot, they consumed massive amounts of power, and they were fundamentally inefficient. But they worked. If a graphic design agency or university needed more speed in 1988, they increasingly found they did not need to wire multiple transputers together. They just had to wait 6 months for Intel to release a faster single processor. The American standard was displacing the British invention simply by moving fast enough to make the transputer's extreme performance feel unnecessary for daily tasks. The high street changed around the object. In a PC world aisle, the shelves were packed with rows of identical IBM-compatible beige boxes running Intel chips and Microsoft software. The customer was not looking for elegant parallel silicon. They were looking for a machine that could run Lotus 1, 2, 3, and WordPerfect. The transputer was nowhere to be seen. It was retreating back into the glass cabinets of university labs and the sealed units of military radar systems. It was still a profitable niche, and Inmos was still generating revenue. But the dream of setting the global standard for desktop computing was fading. The architecture was becoming a highly specialized component rather than the brain of the digital age. The machine worked. The ecosystem around it had already begun to change. And as the software market moved to America, the British government decided it was tired of paying for the hardware. The structural failure of the transputer ecosystem was accelerating, but the final blow came from the reality of British industrial politics and corporate finance. Inmos was a creature of the 1970s, born from a philosophy of state intervention. But by the mid-1980s, the political climate in Britain had fundamentally changed. The government demanded privatization. In 1984, the state sold its controlling stake in Inmos to Thorn EMI, a massive British conglomerate. On paper, it was a domestic technology merger. In reality, it was a disaster. Thorn EMI was a company built on music publishing, television manufacturing, and high-street appliance rentals. They understood consumer electronics, but they did not understand the brutal, cash-intensive warfare of the global semiconductor industry. To compete with Silicon Valley, a chip manufacturer must constantly reinvest massive amounts of capital into research and development, building entirely new fabrication plants just to keep up with the shrinking size of transistors. Intel was spending hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure its next generation of chips would be faster, smaller, and cheaper. Thorn EMI looked at the research budget required to keep the Newport fabrication plant at the bleeding edge of silicon manufacturing and balked. Inmos found itself starved of the investment it desperately needed exactly when the American market was accelerating. The engineering consequences of this financial hesitation manifested in the T9000. The T9000 was supposed to be the chip that saved the British desktop dream. It was designed to leapfrog the Intel 486, introducing advanced architectural concepts like superscalar pipelines, allowing the chip to execute multiple instructions in a single clock cycle, while retaining the brilliant parallel communication links that define the transputer. But building a chip of that complexity required flawless execution, and the Bristol design team was struggling. The transition to a new, smaller manufacturing process at the Newport plant was fraught with yield issues and silicon bugs. The launch date slipped. Then it slipped again. In the semiconductor industry, a delay of 2 years is not a minor setback. It is an eternity. In a Bristol design office, the engineers watched in frustration as their window of opportunity slammed shut. By the time the T9000 was finally ready for volume production in the early 1990s, It was no longer a miracle. Intel had used its vast wealth and massive desktop user base to brute force its way to comparable performance. The American giant was already preparing to launch the Pentium processor, a chip that would define the consumer computing era. The T9000 was technically elegant, but the market simply no longer cared. This was Force 5, corporate consolidation, foreign acquisition, brand survival, and cultural memory. The British technology empire was about to be absorbed. Thorn EMI, bleeding money and eager to exit the semiconductor business, put Inmos up for sale. In 1989, the company that had been founded with £50 million of British taxpayer money to dictate the global future of microprocessors was sold to SGS Thomson Microelectronics, a French-Italian joint venture. SGS Thomson was pragmatic. They looked at the Transputer architecture, looked at Intel's absolute monopoly over the IBM-compatible PC market, and made a cold, rational business decision. They would not fight Silicon Valley for the desktop. Instead, they took the brilliant British parallel architecture, stripped it of its grand destiny as a central computer brain, and relegated it to the background. The Transputer was redesigned to become an embedded microcontroller. It was placed inside digital set-top boxes, satellite decoders, and telecommunications equipment. In a British living room in the late 1990s, beneath a CRT television, a descendant of the Transputer might be quietly processing a digital broadcast signal. It was still performing complex tasks. It was still executing parallel instructions. But the user did not know it was there. It was no longer a platform that developers wrote software for. It was merely a component hidden in a plastic box. The brilliant Occam language faded from university curriculums. The glass cabinets of the Mako computing surface were quietly decommissioned and dismantled. The dream of a British Silicon empire dominating the high street was over. The T9000 arrived too late. The software market moved on. The American standard grew stronger. The developers stopped learning Occam. The magazine adverts vanished. The Newport factory changed management. The desktop was lost. The architecture became a footnote. The ecosystem collapsed. The logo remained. The habit was gone. The company was absorbed. The architecture was sidelined. And the Transputer faded from the desktop. But the idea born in Bristol refused to stay dead. The Inmos brand did not survive the new millennium. SGS Thomson, which eventually evolved into the European semiconductor giant ST Microelectronics, formally retired the Inmos name in the late 1990s. The fabrication plant in Newport went through a dizzying series of ownership changes, passing through the hands of various global tech conglomerates, its original public service ambition entirely forgotten by the modern supply chain. The Transputer, as a commercial computing platform, was definitively dead. But a technology empire does not always end when the factory changes its sign on the high street. Sometimes it survives invisibly in the architecture of the machines that defeated it. There is a surprise footnote to the Inmos story, one that reveals just how profoundly the engineers in Bristol understood the future of computing. In the 2000s, as ST Microelectronics navigated the fiercely competitive global semiconductor market, they began to audit the intellectual property they had acquired in the 1989 buyout. They realized they were sitting on a legal goldmine. The original Inmos patents covering parallel processing, microarchitecture, and chip-to-chip communication were not obsolete historical documents. They were foundational. As the entire technology industry shifted towards parallel architectures, ST Microelectronics weaponized those British patents. They used them to aggressively cross-license technology and extract vast royalties from some of the largest American and Asian technology giants in the world, the very companies that had pushed the Transputer out of the desktop market. Surviving financial accounts suggest that the intellectual property generated by Inmos in the 1980s brought hundreds of millions of dollars into ST Microelectronics decades later, effectively saving entire divisions of the company. The British chips had failed to conquer the office desk, but their legal blueprints quietly taxed the victors. Today, you will not find a Transputer on a high-street electronics shelf, nor will you see the Occam language taught as a mandatory module in a standard comprehensive school ICT room. Instead, the Transputer survives in the meticulous care of British preservationists. At the National Museum of Computing and the Center for Computing History, curators carefully maintain the towering glass cabinets of old Mako computing surfaces. On vintage computer forums, a dedicated subculture of engineers and collectors spend their weekends painstakingly repairing rare Sur 4 evaluation boards and Atari Transputer workstations, hunting down degraded floppy disks containing the Helios operating system. On modern developer platforms, you can still find programmers writing software emulators for the architecture, drawn to the mathematical elegance of Occam and the way it handles data without the messy compromises of modern languages. They are preserving it not just as a historical relic, but as a masterpiece of pure logic. This is not nostalgia. A T800 transputer resting under a glass museum case is a physical argument about the trajectory of modern technology. It is a reminder that the current architecture of the world was not the only way forward, nor was it necessarily the best. Look at the device in your pocket, or the vast cloud servers powering the modern internet. By the mid-2000s, the American brute force approach to processor speed finally hit a physical wall. Intel and its rivals could no longer simply increase the clock speed of a single processor without the silicon literally melting from the heat. To keep making computers faster, Silicon Valley was forced to abandon the sequential past and adopt the exact philosophy that Inmos had pioneered in 1985. They had to put multiple processor cores on a single piece of silicon and make them communicate in parallel. Multi-core computing, the absolute foundation of every modern smartphone, laptop, app store, and data center, is the transputer dream, finally realized at a global scale. The American giants eventually built the parallel future, but they built it 20 years after a team of British engineers had already proved it worked in a Welsh fabrication plant. The story of the transputer is the ultimate lesson in the five forces of the British technology market. It proves that raw hardware brilliance, backed by millions in state funding and the finest university minds, is never enough. Britain did not stop inventing. It simply lost the system that turned invention into scale. Inmos built a machine that could process the future faster than anything else on Earth, but they could not force a massive, entrenched global ecosystem to throw away its old software. They lost because they asked a comfortable market to fundamentally change its habits, while American competitors simply asked the market to buy a slightly faster version of what it already understood. The architecture was flawless. The ecosystem was unyielding. Somewhere in a British university archive, a T800 transputer still sits quietly inside an anti-static bag, its square ceramic body and gold-plated pins completely pristine. It is no longer wired to a network, no longer waiting for a stream of Occam code to orchestrate its logic, but it remains exactly what it was built to be: a perfect, silent blueprint of a future that Britain held in its hands before watching the rest of the world sell it back to them. See you in the next one.